Hi folks, in this screencast we're going to go over the diversity of bacterial cellular life in preparation for talking about the kinds of cells we're made of, eukaryotic cells. We're going to start with the heterotrophic bacterium and go through the very basic parts of what it's going to be composed of. And please understand this is a gross simplification, very simplified version of this. First thing you need is some sort of barrier between the interior and the outside world. That's going to be your cell membrane, which you may be aware of has some phospholipids as well as proteins and others. In addition to a cell membrane, most bacteria are going to have something called a cell wall. Now, this is not made of the same components or have even the same function necessarily as the cell walls of plant cells, which are made of cellulose, or even the cell walls of fungal cells, which are made of something called chitin and other materials. This cell wall in bacterium can be quite complex, can have actually membranous components as well as complex carbohydrates such as peptidoglycan. We're not going to go into the details of that. Just please understand it's not the same as a cell wall of another cell type. Okay, so these cells, just like ours, other than water, are primarily made of protein. In order to make those proteins, you got to have the instructions. The instructions are in the form of DNA. Now, you've learned that before. The key thing here is that unlike our cells, which have, you may be aware, 46 linear chromosomes, bacteria only have a single chromosome, and it's a loop. It's a single circular chromosome, as you see here. In addition, they may have small additional loops called plasmids. We're not going to talk about them right now. We'll get to them in a different unit. Okay, so we've got the instructions for making proteins, which is what most of the cell is other than water. We also need to be able to make those proteins. The protein-making machinery consists of things like ribosomes, which you may have heard of, as well as mRNAs, tRNAs, and other materials. These are just going to be diffuse throughout the cytosol of these cells. Okay, the other thing that we're going to need, two things. One is the ability to bring in additional molecules so that you can grow. Just because you have the ability to make proteins doesn't mean you have the raw materials. So, one, you're going to need to be able to import stuff from the outside world. So you're going to need to have enzymes to digest food from outside. Maybe you come across some dead matter and you can decompose it. So you need some enzymes to break that thing down all the way to monomer form. And then you have to have some way of getting them through your membrane, which again is a pretty significant barrier. Monomers like glucose are not going to go straight through a phospholipid bilayer cell membrane. Okay. In addition to this, we also need the ability to fuel cellular processes. So building things takes energy, moving takes energy. And so the form that you've heard of before is a molecule known as ATP. So we're going to need a bunch of enzymes to be able to do cellular respiration. Maybe you've heard of that before. And that's going to allow us to burn some of the excess monomers that we bring in. And generate some or regenerate some of the ATP that we've been using up. Okay, to recap, we're going to need a barrier between the inside and the outside world. We're going to need some sort of instructions for making proteins, the ability to make proteins, the ability to take in monomers so that you can build stuff, and the ability to burn some of those monomers, glucose, for example, to generate the chemical energy, or at least harvest the chemical energy necessary to grow, move, and maintain ourselves, or themselves in the case of bacteria. Okay, this is one type of bacterium, a heterotrophic bacterium. That means it's taking in food from the outside world. We're going to compare that briefly to an autotrophic bacterium. And an autotrophic bacterium is, in my estimation, way cooler because instead of taking in food and then burning it for energetic purposes, they harvest stuff themselves and build stuff themselves. So here we go. The key proteins that are worth being aware of are these things called photosystems. And these allow them to harvest light energy and convert that solar energy into chemical energy by regenerating ATP. That's pretty cool. We can't do that, not even close. The other thing that they can do is they can use some of that chemical energy, some of that ATP, And they have enzymes that allow them to take base materials like CO2 and water and nitrates and phosphates, like nothing complex, just base materials available in nature, and to use them to synthesize the glucose, the amino acids, the nucleotides, etc., from scratch. Again, we can't do any of that. We can't synthesize amino acids from scratch. We can't synthesize glucose from scratch. That's what these folks can do. And if you haven't figured it out yet, this process is photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the ability to harvest light energy to generate ATP and then to immediately use that to synthesize monomers from scratch, specifically sugars. So how to compare these two types of cells? Well, there are a couple terms that make this easier. So autotrophic really means that you're producing stuff yourself. You're not eating food from the outside. In comparison, the heterotrophic bacterium, what that word really means is that you're consuming food from the outside world. Okay, now I want you to see sort of the grand diversity of life, because what we've talked about are sort of a couple branches to simplify this. And if you imagine this as an evolutionary tree, and I'm going to get rid of some of these lines in just a second, the autotrophic and heterotrophic bacteria are a couple massive branches on this tree of life. In addition to that, there's stuff that you've never even heard of probably. Archaeal cells are wildly diverse and found throughout nature, and you've probably never heard of them or seen them or read about them at all. And unfortunately, we're not going to spend a lot of time going over them. What is important to know is that archaea are our cousins, like more recently related to us and our ancestors than bacteria are in many ways. So you can see on the screencast right here, there's this word proto-eukaryotes. These are kind of our ancestors, and you can see that they are on the archaeal branch, not the bacterial branch, the archaeal branch. That being said, all of this stuff is related to itself. In terms of, we all had a common ancestor, and the most recent common ancestor, or what's known here as LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, it had a lot of the characteristics that we all share, meaning that all of life on Earth uses DNA as a genetic material. All of life on Earth has phospholipids as a membrane of some sort, though those phospholipids might differ. Our genetic codes are similar, etc., etc. And so we are all, to some extent, cousins. Distant, but definitely still related. All right. In the next video, what we'll go over is how our ancestors actually come from merging some of these branches back together again, which is wildly strange, but we'll get to that next time. Hope that helped, everybody.